I gave birth to him, raised him, taught him everything I knew. Together with his father, we built the business where he took his very first steps. I believed that one day he would take it all with gratitude. But instead of gratitude, I heard something colder. You've become a burden. He thought he had it all in his hands. He just didn't realize one thing. The documents still bore my signature. And when the time came, I reminded him who truly owned this story. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Helen Pierce, and I was 63 years old the year everything changed. I lived in Bloomington, Indiana, in a 2-story brick house not far from the main street where most of our town's life pulsed. For over 30 years, I had been more than just a resident of that town. I had been one of its builders. Alongside my late husband, Robert, I had helped open the first Pierce's Cafe, a modest little place with creaky floors and hand-stitched curtains in the windows. I wasn't a chef, nor a barista, nor a marketing genius. I was the numbers woman. I managed payrolls and taxes, balanced accounts, negotiated leases, and fought insurance companies when they tried to raise our premiums without cause. Robert was the soul of the business, charming, good-humored, able to remember the names of every regular customer's kids. But I was its backbone. When Robert passed away 8 years ago, a heart attack too sudden and too cruel, I didn't walk away. I stayed, not because I needed the money, we had planned well, but because the business was a living part of him, of us. Leaving it would have felt like a second burial. Our son, Jason, had grown up in that cafe. I still had the photo of him at 5 years old, standing on a milk crate behind the counter, pretending to pour coffee for imaginary customers. When he was a teenager, we put him to work for real, sweeping floors, scrubbing dishes, learning the rhythms of opening and closing. At first, he grumbled like any kid would, but over time he grew into it. I watched him charm customers with the same easy smile his father had. I watched him learn the business from the inside out. When Robert died, Jason was 32. He stepped up, as we had hoped he would. He started managing the day-to-day operations, hiring new staff, opening 2 more locations in nearby towns. I was proud, quietly proud. I didn't interfere unless he asked for help. I still came into the office every morning, handled the bookkeeping, monitored the ledgers, filed quarterly reports. We didn't talk about it, but the balance was understood. He ran the show, but I kept the lights on behind the curtain. The ownership papers had been signed long ago, when we were expanding the first time. Robert and I had insisted on it then. Equal shares between us, 50-50. After Robert's death, I inherited his share. Jason had never pushed to change that, or at least he hadn't until recently. The first signs that something was shifting came quietly, meetings where I wasn't invited, marketing plans I saw only after they had been executed, financial reports arriving late, with explanations that felt a little too rehearsed. At first, I brushed it off. He was busy. The business was growing. Maybe he just forgot. But deep down, I knew better. You don't forget your partner. Not when the foundation you're standing on was built with their hands. I stayed silent, observing, collecting small clues. He started speaking differently, too. Talking about streamlining the brand, about modernizing our image, words that weren't bad on their own. But when he said them, I felt the ground shifting under me, and then came the small but unmistakable gestures. My office space moved to the back of the building, next to the storage closet. I found myself no longer copied on important emails. Staff members who once greeted me warmly now offered awkward smiles and hurried past. I became a ghost inside a place I had helped build from the ground up. I wasn't foolish. I knew Jason loved the business. I knew he wanted it to thrive. But I also knew ambition could sharpen into something uglier when it was left unchecked. I had seen it happen to other families in town. Fathers pushed aside by sons with new ideas, mothers quietly erased from businesses they had nurtured through harder times. Still, a part of me refused to believe it could happen to us. Not after everything. Not after the countless weekends spent working when other families went on vacation. Not after missing Jason's soccer games to renegotiate supplier contracts. Not after borrowing against our home to open the second cafe when the bank refused us a loan. I had been there at every step, every late night, every exhausted morning, every celebration when we paid off another loan or made payroll during a rough season. And now I felt the slow, careful movements of being written out of my own story. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I stayed. I watched. I listened. And I waited. It happened on a Monday morning that was colder than usual for April. I remember that because I had bundled myself into a heavier sweater before leaving the house, one that Harold had bought me years ago at a farmer's market, thick, soft, the color of honey. I thought about him as I buttoned it up, about how he used to say that Mondays were made for brave hearts and good coffee. I carried that thought with me into the office, holding it like a shield. The office smelled of fresh paint. Jason had decided to refresh the walls with a sleek gray tone that he said was more on brand with the new vision. It made the place feel colder, more corporate. The warm reds and golds Harold and I had picked years ago were gone, just like that. I stood in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, just feeling the unfamiliarity of it all. Jason was already waiting inside. He sat behind the new glass-top desk he had installed a few months ago, a laptop open in front of him, fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the keyboard. He looked up and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. I knew that smile. I had seen it in boardrooms, in negotiations. It was a prelude to bad news. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, setting my purse carefully on the floor beside my chair. There was a folder on the desk between us. It was closed, but I recognized the weight of it. Documents, papers that had been prepared in advance. My stomach twisted a little, but I kept my face neutral. He started with small talk, asked if I was still going to the book club on Thursdays, if the tulips had started blooming yet in the backyard. I answered politely, nodding, watching him dance around the real reason I was there. Finally, he cleared his throat and leaned back, the leather chair squeaking slightly under his movement. "Mom, we've been thinking," he said. The "we" was important. It meant this conversation wasn't just him. It was him and someone else, his wife perhaps, or his business consultant, or some lawyer I hadn't yet met. It didn't matter. The point was, I was about to be outnumbered. He explained in the practiced, soothing tone of someone delivering a corporate restructuring plan that the business was evolving, that the industry was changing. That new leadership was necessary to stay competitive. He used words like streamline and restructure and optimize, words that were meant to sound smart, forward-thinking, inevitable. Then he said it. "It's time for you to step back, Mom. You've done more than enough. You deserve to enjoy life now without the burden of work. Burden. The word hit me harder than I thought it would. He said it so casually, as if he hadn't just taken 30 years of my life and folded them into a paper airplane to toss out the window. I didn't speak. I just sat there, listening as he detailed the transition plan. I would be given an honorary title, Founder Emeritus. I would still be consulted for big decisions, though, of course, without any formal voting power. He smiled like it was a gift, like he was giving me something. I noticed then that he didn't look me directly in the eye. He kept glancing at the folder between us as if it would rescue him. He slid the folder across the desk toward me. Inside were papers formalizing everything he had just said. There were lines about my contributions, about honoring my legacy, about ensuring a smooth transition. It was all written in that slippery legal language that sounded kind, but was built to strip you cleanly of authority. I didn't open it. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and studied him. The set of his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he kept shifting in his seat. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't trying to hurt me. In his mind, he was doing what needed to be done. But he had forgotten something critical. I wasn't just the woman who balanced the books or smiled at the grandkids on holidays. I was the co-founder, the co-owner. My name wasn't a footnote. It was on every major document. It was written into the bones of this business the way my sweat was written into its walls. Still, I said nothing about that. Not yet. I thanked him for thinking of me. I told him I would take the documents home and review them carefully. He looked relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. I stood up, smoothed my sweater, picked up my purse. As I turned to leave, I paused and looked back at him. "You know, Jason," I said quietly, "you were always a good boy. Curious, clever. You just need to remember, sometimes the things that look like burdens are actually the things holding you up." He didn't answer. He just nodded, already reaching for his phone, already moving on. I walked out of the office into the sharp spring air, feeling it bite at my cheeks, waking me up fully. I wasn't a burden, and I wasn't going anywhere. When I got home that afternoon, I didn't go straight to the kitchen like I usually did. I didn't put on the kettle or sit by the window to sort through the day's mail. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my coat still buttoned up to my neck, staring at the old oak cabinet by the staircase. It was a heavy, wide thing, scuffed with age, the kind of piece you don't buy, you inherit. Harold's grandfather had built it, and Harold had insisted we keep it even when it didn't match the rest of the furniture. Inside that cabinet was the life we had built piece by piece. Papers, contracts, deeds, insurance policies. It was where I had stored everything that truly mattered. I had opened it 1,000 times before, but that afternoon, my hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the stiff doors and knelt down to the bottom drawer. The smell of old paper and wood dust rose up immediately, so familiar it almost calmed me. I pulled out the heavy leather binder marked Business, a relic from a different era, thick with plastic sleeves protecting every important document we had ever signed. I placed it carefully on the dining room table and flipped through it. Every turn of a page felt like uncovering a piece of armor I had forgotten I was wearing. There was the original partnership agreement between Harold and me, dated 27 years ago. I traced my fingers over our signatures. Ink faded but clear, 50% ownership each, right there in black and white. No automatic transfer of shares, no expiration date, no small print giving our son carte blanche once we passed a certain age. I turned more pages and found the amendment we had made when we incorporated Pierce's Cafe into an LLC. The amendment still listed my name, not honorary, not symbolic, equal partner, my name. Then there was the deed to the properties. The first cafe on Main Street, the second one near the university, and the small administrative building we had bought to house the office and bakery. All of it listed under the LLC's ownership, and by extension, equally mine. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it all settle. Jason hadn't bothered to check, or he thought I had forgotten. He assumed time had erased my claim the way new paint had erased the old warmth of the office walls. I opened a second, smaller binder labeled Correspondence. Letters from banks, from our accountant, from suppliers, and nestled among them a neatly stapled letter from our attorney, dated just after Harold's passing. It confirmed the automatic transfer of Harold's share to me under the terms of our operating agreement. I smiled without meaning to. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was sad, really, that it had come to this, that I had to prove myself to my own son with documents and signatures and legal language. But sadness didn't cloud my thinking. It clarified it. I gathered the key documents and laid them out in order. Ownership agreement, deed of properties, updated will, attorney's letter. I made copies of each one, printing them on crisp new paper. I placed the originals back in their plastic sleeves and returned them to the binder, closing it with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the empty house. Then I sat down at my laptop and began drafting an email to Diane, the family lawyer who had worked with us for years. I told her everything, what Jason had said, what he had proposed, what documents I had reviewed. I asked her to review everything herself and advise me on my rights. It was nearly midnight when I finally shut down the laptop and turned off the lights. As I moved through the dark house, I touched familiar surfaces: the back of the sofa, the edge of the kitchen counter, the worn banister on the stairs. This was my life, not a placeholder, not a relic, mine. In bed, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Jason. His words had stung, yes, but there was something else under the sting now. A slow-burning anger, tempered by something sharper, resolve. I thought of the nights Harold and I spent sitting at the kitchen table, balancing budgets, dreaming up ideas, figuring out how to survive another season. I thought of how hard we had worked, not just to build a business, but to build a life worth having. A life where we could hand something down to Jason, yes, but not at the cost of our own dignity. I thought of Jason as a little boy, how he used to crawl into my lap after a bad dream and whisper, "Mommy, don't let anything happen." And how I had promised every time, "I won't." Promises made to a child don't disappear just because the child grows up. I had protected him once. Now I would protect myself. And in the morning, I would start making sure that when the next uncomfortable conversation came, and I knew it would, I would be ready, not with anger, but with facts, with proof, with the truth in my hands, ready to be seen. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the hours themselves were reluctant to carry me toward what I already knew was coming. Jason didn't call. He didn't stop by the house. Instead, he communicated through short, clipped emails about operational matters, signing them with his full name like we were strangers doing business. I noticed changes almost immediately, small ones at first, subtle enough that someone less familiar might have missed them. The weekly staff meetings were shifted to times when I wasn't available. New marketing initiatives launched without my review. Vendors I had known for years were replaced with newer, flashier names. I watched all of it unfold from a growing distance, like a guest at my own table. I showed up every morning to the office anyway. I sat at my desk, answered emails, reviewed the accounting files, quietly noting every deviation, every decision made without consultation. I made copies of everything. I kept records. If Jason wanted to play a new kind of game, I would play too. But I would play it the way Harold had taught me, patiently, carefully, never bluffing unless I had the winning hand. The atmosphere in the office shifted with the changes. Staff who had once been friendly now greeted me with careful politeness, their smiles tight, their eyes flickering toward Jason's office before they spoke. Meetings became stiffer, the conversation less open. It was clear that Jason had begun framing the narrative, an older partner stepping back, a younger team stepping forward, a necessary evolution. I could almost hear his rehearsed speeches behind closed doors. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. Jason talking to one of our district managers, joking lightly about Mom's retirement party and how they might need to throw something small just to make it official. I stood frozen outside the copy room, my hands full of invoices, listening to my own erasure being planned with laughter. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I began attending board meetings more formally. I requested copies of minutes. I submitted written questions about financial reports and contracts. Jason looked increasingly uncomfortable as I asserted my rights, not aggressively, but unmistakably. I made it clear that I was not fading away quietly. Meanwhile, I kept visiting the locations. The original cafe on Main Street still smelled of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon, just as it had the day we opened it. The young baristas there welcomed me with wide smiles. Some of them didn't even know who I really was. I stayed longer than necessary during those visits, watching the heartbeat of what Harold and I had built still beating strong, still belonging to us. At the second location near the university, I noticed new posters advertising a rebranding effort. Sleeker logos, modern furniture, a stripped-down menu, Jason's vision. But the old customers, the ones who had come in every morning for 15 years, looked lost among the changes. They ordered their coffee and sat quietly, out of place in a world that had been scrubbed of familiarity. One evening after closing time, I sat alone in the Main Street cafe with a cup of coffee. The door locked, the lights dimmed to a soft glow. I looked around at the walls, the worn wooden floors, the chalkboard menus still handwritten in the same careful style I had taught our first cashier to use. I remembered late nights repainting the trim with Harold, arguing about colors. I remembered Jason sitting on the counter swinging his legs, asking endless questions about coffee beans and cash registers and why customers sometimes looked sad when they ordered just a cup of black coffee. This business wasn't a brand. It was a home. And Jason had forgotten that. He saw an opportunity to modernize, to grow, to push forward without the heavy weight of gratitude or memory slowing him down. But he had miscalculated. He thought I was sentimental. He thought sentimentality would make me weak. He didn't understand that sentiment wasn't weakness, it was strength. The strength to know what was worth fighting for. At night, I reviewed contracts by lamplight. I met with Diane twice a week, updating her on every development, asking questions, refining my strategy. I wasn't planning a battle. I was preparing a defense, because Jason wasn't just trying to push me out. He was trying to rewrite the story entirely, and I wasn't going to let him. Each new game he played, each strategic omission, each quiet erasure, only strengthened my resolve. I had spent too many years building this business with my own two hands to watch it be swept out from under me by someone who hadn't yet learned the cost of what he wanted to inherit. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. The day of the board meeting arrived with a strange, deliberate slowness. I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in darkness. The only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs. I moved through my morning routine carefully, almost ceremonially, brewing a strong pot of coffee, setting out my notes, reviewing the documents one final time. The board meetings had always been casual affairs before. Harold and I had designed them that way intentionally. Open discussions around a conference table, with pastries and laughter, and sometimes even arguments about baseball scores before we got down to business. But this meeting felt different. Formal invitations had been sent. An agenda had been circulated. Jason's name appeared at the top of the header, not mine. When I arrived at the office, the atmosphere was taut, brittle. Jason's assistant barely made eye contact as she handed me a folder with the printed agenda. I tucked it under my arm and made my way to the conference room, the low hum of whispers trailing behind me like smoke. Inside, Jason was already seated at the head of the table, wearing a new suit that still had the stiffness of the store on it. He smiled when he saw me, but it was a tight, business-like smile. Nothing like the boy who used to grin at me from behind the counter while sneaking extra cookies to customers. The board members trickled in, faces I had known for years, some older, some newer, a few carefully avoiding my gaze. When the last chair was filled, Jason stood up, cleared his throat, and began. He spoke smoothly, confidently, delivering a presentation that had clearly been rehearsed to the last detail. He talked about growth strategies, modernization efforts, expanding into new markets. He praised the past, yes, but only briefly, as a preamble to explaining why the future demanded different leadership. His leadership. He proposed a new organizational structure, streamlined, efficient, and entirely under his control. Then, with the same practiced calm, he moved to the final item on the agenda, the formal transition of authority, the transfer of operational power from previous management to the new executive team. In other words, himself and the few loyalists he had cultivated carefully over the past year. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the board, as if willing them to see me as just another obstacle to progress. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence when he finished. A few polite nods, a clearing of throats. Then Jason gestured toward the table where a stack of documents waited neatly. "These are the proposed agreements," he said. "We would appreciate Helen's cooperation in signing them today to make the transition smooth for everyone." He said it with such finality, such quiet arrogance, that for a moment I could feel the room tipping toward him, the inevitability of it like a tide pulling against my ankles. I let the moment stretch. Then I stood up. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own stack of papers, thicker, heavier, protected by clear plastic sleeves. I laid them neatly on the table in front of me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout or pound the table. I simply began to speak, clearly, methodically, walking them through the facts. First, I produced the original partnership agreement, highlighting my 50% ownership. Then the amendment post Harold's death, confirming the full inheritance of his share to me. The deeds to the properties, registered in the name of the LLC, in which I held controlling interest. The operating agreement requiring unanimous consent from all primary shareholders, that is, me, for any major structural changes. I saw the color drain slowly from Jason's face as I continued. One of the older board members, Mr. Whitmore, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses, studying the documents carefully. Another, Mrs. Daniels, exchanged a glance with her colleague, eyebrows raised slightly. I outlined, step by step, every instance where Jason had made unilateral decisions without board approval, every financial move that violated our internal protocols. I laid bare the quiet coup he had been orchestrating behind closed doors. And then I ended with a simple, indisputable fact. Without my consent, I said calmly, none of these changes are legally valid. Silence fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, gently, firmly. There's no need for a debate, I said. The documents speak for themselves. I gathered my papers, returned them neatly to my bag, and sat down. For several long minutes, no one spoke. Then Mr. Whitmore, clearing his throat, said what everyone was thinking. Well, he said slowly, it appears we have some serious matters to reconsider. The meeting adjourned shortly afterward. No votes were taken, no transitions formalized. Jason left the room without a word to me, his steps stiff and uneven. I remained seated for a while longer, breathing in the heavy stillness. The strike had been made, not with anger, not with shouting, with truth, with evidence, with the quiet, immovable force of a woman who knew exactly what she had built and would not allow herself to be erased. In the days following the meeting, the air between Jason and me turned colder than the sharpest winter wind. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, our words were clipped, professional, stripped of the warmth that had once lived so naturally between us. The casual familiarity we once shared was gone, replaced by something brittle and foreign. At the office, Jason buried himself in work, retreating behind closed doors, holding private meetings I was no longer invited to attend. I didn't push. I didn't demand explanations. I simply carried on, present at every board meeting, every financial review, every major decision. If he wanted to pretend I wasn't there, he would have to pretend harder. The staff felt the tension, though they tried to hide it. Conversations fell silent when I walked into a room. Smiles were a little too quick, too forced. I knew they were caught between loyalty and fear, unsure which side was safer. I didn't blame them. Jason was their day-to-day boss now. I was the ghost in the background, still holding the keys they needed, but no longer the hand they wanted to shake. Jason stopped updating me on projects. He moved forward with renovations at the university cafe without consulting me. He altered vendor contracts, hired new management consultants, all without seeking approval. Each move was a quiet rebellion, a way of saying, I don't need you. But each time I responded with the same steady approach: documentation, formal inquiries, gentle but firm reminders that, legally, every decision still required my consent. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. My presence alone was a wall he could not climb over. At home, the loneliness weighed heavier than I expected. Evenings stretched out longer than they used to. I would sit in my living room with a book in my lap, the words blurring together as my mind wandered back through years of memories. Jason as a boy, racing across the yard with his shoelaces undone, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Jason as a teenager, slamming the door in a fury over curfews and car keys. Jason on his wedding day, gripping my hand nervously before walking down the aisle. He had been mine once, Before ambition and pride and the slow, grinding machinery of adulthood changed the way he saw me, now he saw me as an obstacle. It hurt more than I cared to admit, but pain was not going to guide my decisions. I had spent too many years teaching him about responsibility, about integrity, about the weight of promises made. I would not abandon those lessons now just because it was inconvenient. One evening, Diane called after reviewing the latest contracts Jason had tried to push through without authorization. Her voice was calm but firm. He was skating close to legal trouble now: breach of fiduciary duty, violations of the operating agreement. If I chose to, I could sue him. I thanked her and hung up, staring out the window into the darkened street. I didn't want lawsuits. I didn't want public battles or headlines in the local paper. I wanted my son to remember who I was, who we were, what we had built together. But I was slowly realizing that sometimes love was not enough to bridge the gap created by greed and pride. The break between us was no longer a crack to be patched. It had become a canyon. And each day he chose to ignore me, each silent act of defiance widened that canyon further. There were moments, quiet ones, when I wondered if Harold would have seen this coming. If he would have known that the same ambition we had tried to nurture in Jason would one day turn inward, consuming everything in its path. I missed Harold's voice more in those days than I had in years. Jason and I operated like two parallel tracks now, never intersecting, never crossing paths unless absolutely necessary. We existed in the same spaces, breathing the same air, but living in entirely different worlds. Some nights I dreamed of calling him, of inviting him over for dinner like we used to, of sitting across from each other with plates of Harold's favorite meatloaf and finding a way back to each other. But every morning, the reality returned. There was no easy path back. There was only forward, through the silence, through the cold, through the break. It happened late on a Thursday evening, the kind of evening where the sky fades into a muted navy and the whole world seems to hold its breath. I had just finished locking up the Main Street Cafe, lingering over every task as if the slowness could somehow anchor me to steadier ground. I turned off the lights, feeling the familiar echo of empty space, and stepped outside into the crisp night air. Jason was waiting by my car. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, head bowed like he was thinking through every word he might say before it left his mouth. I paused, keys dangling from my fingers, feeling the heavy weight of what was about to pass between us. It was not anger I felt, not fear, just a deep, steady sorrow, like standing on the edge of something you know you cannot mend. He straightened up when he saw me, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his jacket. For a long moment, we just stood there, a few feet apart, two stubborn echoes of the people we used to be. He spoke first. He said he hadn't meant for things to go this way, that he had only wanted to take the business to the next level, to honor what Dad had built. His words stumbled over themselves, trying to sound rehearsed, but falling apart in the face of reality. He said he never expected me to fight him, that he thought I would understand. I listened, quiet and unmoving, letting him empty his heart out into the cold night air. Then it was my turn. I told him I remembered when he was 8 years old and wanted to build a tree house in the backyard. He had gathered scraps of wood, some crooked nails, and a rusted hammer, determined to build it without help. I watched him from the kitchen window, stubborn and proud, balancing broken boards against each other until the whole thing collapsed in a heap. That afternoon, he had come inside, cheeks flushed with frustration, and I had sat him down at the kitchen table. I didn't scold him. I didn't mock him. I told him that if you build on a weak foundation, no amount of nails could hold it up. I told him that night again, standing in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight. Foundations matter. He turned his head, staring down the empty street, jaw clenched tight. I wondered if he was remembering it too, the way Harold had eventually come outside, showing him how to level the beams properly, how to measure twice before driving the first nail. I reminded Jason that Harold had never built anything by cutting corners or stepping on the people who loved him, that every late night, every hard decision had been guided by two things: pride in his work and love for his family. I told him he had forgotten both. There was no anger in my voice, just the simple, clean honesty of a wound too deep for rage. He said he didn't know how to fix it. I told him some things couldn't be fixed, only acknowledged. He asked if we could go back. Start over. I shook my head slowly. Love, I told him, isn't a game you win by erasing the people who helped you play. Trust isn't something you rebuild with contracts and apologies whispered in the dark. I told him the business would remain as it was, that I would not be signing it over, that I would stay until I decided otherwise, not because I needed the title, but because it was mine to protect. Jason didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just stood there, hands still jammed deep into his pockets, looking smaller somehow, like the little boy who once believed I could fix anything if I only tried hard enough. I thought for a moment that he might cry, but he didn't. He simply nodded once, stiffly, like a soldier saluting before walking away from a battlefield he knew he could not reclaim. I watched him leave, his figure swallowed by the darkness of the empty parking lot. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. It wrapped around me like a shawl, heavy but strangely warm. I stood there for a long while after he disappeared, breathing in the cool night air, letting the finality of the moment settle into my bones. This was the end of something, but it was also the beginning of something else. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, freedom, not the kind that came from winning a battle, the kind that came from knowing I had never truly lost myself in the first place. The morning after our conversation, the light broke through my bedroom window in slow, deliberate strokes, painting the walls in muted gold. I lay there for a while before getting up, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had passed settle somewhere deep inside me. It was not heaviness in the way sorrow often feels. It was something quieter, sturdier, a kind of calm. I moved through the house with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. I brewed coffee, thick and strong, the way Harold used to like it, and sat at the kitchen table where so many important decisions had once been made. In front of me were two folders. One contained the papers Jason had tried to have me sign. The other held the documents that told the true story of ownership, of history, of a lifetime of work that could not be erased by a few ambitious signatures. I opened the first folder, running my hand over the crisp, impersonal papers he had so carefully prepared. In another life, another time, maybe I would have felt guilt. Maybe I would have been tempted to give in, to make the transition easier, smoother, for the sake of peace. But I knew better now. Peace built on erasure was not peace at all. It was surrender. I pushed the folder aside and opened the second one. The original documents felt heavier in my hands, as if the weight of all those years had soaked into the paper itself. I read through them again slowly, savoring the memory of each signature, each decision that had brought me here. Harold's bold scrawl next to mine, the seal from our lawyer's office, the dates carved into time like milestones along a winding road. At the bottom of each page, I saw it, my name, my signature, proof that I had been here, proof that I had mattered. Later that afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Diane. We sat in her sunlit office, the smell of leather and old books filling the room. I explained everything, what Jason had attempted, what I intended to do next. Diane nodded quietly, her eyes sharp and knowing. Together, we drafted a formal reaffirmation of ownership, a document that outlined in unmistakable terms the structure of the business, the rights attached to each stake, and the conditions under which any future changes would require my explicit, written consent. It was a declaration not of war, but of stewardship. When she slid the final version across the desk to me, I picked up the pen without hesitation. I signed it, Helen Pierce. The ink bled smoothly into the paper, sealing what had always been true, but now stood fortified against any further attempts to unmake it. Leaving the lawyer's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked through the town square with the easy steps of someone who had reclaimed something precious. I passed by the bakery where Harold and I used to buy bread on Saturday mornings, the little bookstore where Jason had spent hours as a boy, sitting cross-legged between the aisles, lost in worlds only he could see. I was still here, still standing, still Helen. Back at the Main Street Cafe, I found myself drifting toward the old bulletin board by the counter, the one where regulars pinned business cards, flyers for local plays, photos of their dogs. I smiled at how full it had become. Life layered on life. I pinned something there too, a small handwritten note on thick cream-colored paper. It said, "Built with love, protected with pride, still standing. No one would notice it right away. It would get buried under advertisements for yoga classes and missing cat posters. But it would be there, quiet and certain, a thread stitched into the fabric of the place, just like me." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, I sat on the porch of my home and thought about the word signature. Not just ink on paper, but something deeper. A signature was a claim, yes, but also a promise, a testimony, a marker left behind to say, "I was here, I built this, I am part of its story." Jason had tried to write a new story without me, but some signatures cannot be erased. Mine was written not just on deeds and documents, but on walls painted by my hands, menus crafted at my kitchen table, relationships built one cup of coffee at a time. The cafe, the business, the legacy, all still carried my name, whether Jason wanted to acknowledge it or not. I didn't know what the future would bring. Maybe he would find his way back, maybe not. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I watched the stars appear, one by one, in the wide indigo sky. Whatever came next, I would face it with my head high, my heart steady, and my signature firmly where it belonged. Exactly where it had always been,